Thank you so much for your remarks and for your leadership in this online safety space. We look forward to working with you and your colleagues as the Online Safety Act, which is now a reality. We've been talking about the Online Safety Bill for so long. I'm still finding it hard to say Online Safety Act. As it begins to be implemented, and as we will definitely stay close in touch with the developments, and particularly those that have come out of the AI Safety Summit, as much as they particularly impact kids and young people. We're just resetting the stage for a second. I want to say good morning to our friends in Australia and New Zealand who've just got up. Thanks. Hello. We know there's quite a few tuning in, so good to see you, and others in the APAC region. So with that, I think my stage manager will give me the thumbs up. Yeah, she gave me the thumbs up. I'll invite our final panel to come onto the stage. And is this microphone's working? Great. Okay. So, to conclude our conference, I guess we've saved the best to last. We have two very special guests that I've had the privilege of working with on both sides of the Atlantic in the past year or so. First, we have FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter. Becca has been a commissioner at the FTC since May of 2018. Prior to your appointment, you spent a decade working in the US Senate, almost all with Chuck Schumer.
All.
She can show you the scars. Okay. Commissioner Slaughter believes that the FTC's dual missions of promoting competition and protecting consumers are interconnected and complementary, correct?
Yes.
Good. And she's mindful that enforcement or rulemaking in one arena can have far-reaching implications for the other. And most importantly, according to her bio, she has a wonderful husband and 4 amazing children. So that's pretty impressive. Please welcome Rebecca Slaughter. Next, we have Gill Whitehead, Group Director of Online Safety at Ofcom, leading the UK communications regulator's new responsibilities in enforcing what we've just been hearing about, the newly established Online Safety Act. She had a wide and varied career with stints at Google, Channel 4, and BBC. And I think the most interesting thing is you've been a non-executive director at the British Olympic Association and chair of the next Women's Rugby World Cup in England. Is that right?
That's right.
Please welcome Gill Whitehead. So, why don't we begin with what we've just heard? Any impressions, any reflections on the minister's speech?
Well, it's really interesting, fascinating, and I think important for us to hear about what's happening in the UK with the Online Safety Act. As the minister said, online companies don't really know borders the way we traditionally did, and so what happens in the UK and in other jurisdictions really will have profound implications here, and I think they're going to be really valuable lessons for us to learn as we observe the implementation and hopefully benefit from some of the successes of the Act in practice.
Brilliant. First thoughts, first reflections?
Sure. So I think, and genuinely, we think it's a major step forward in terms of achieving a safer life online in the UK, particularly for children. And I should say, as the regulator leading the task of implementing that law in the UK, the regulator is independent of government. So I'm not saying that because I have to. We genuinely believe it's a major step forward. We're ready to implement. So we have built a team of 350 people who come from a variety of sectors, civil society, frontline charity organisations such as the NSPCC. We have many formerly from law enforcement, a lot of people from freedom of expression, journalistic backgrounds. It's really important to balance these things, and some people like me who've spent time in the tech sector and also in academia. So I think the range of expertise is really important. And with that, we have over 100 researchers and analysts, and I think that is testament to a real evidence-based approach to decision making. So we're really interested in the harms and the pathway to harm, but then also what makes for effective mitigations. And so that's kind of, I've been regulated by Ofcom for probably over 15 years in my career, and I think that is what you get from Ofcom, is a really pragmatic, evidence-based regulator that really cares about freedom of expression and cares about proportionality. So I think it all, what we will do is work really closely with tech firms, large and small, so that they understand what they need to do to comply. But we also understand where there is best practice, where there is innovation, where there are different ways of achieving the same goals in terms of making children's life safer online. So I can say this literally because we announced all of our things at the end of all of our publications at the end of last week. It all starts today.
Yeah, I mean, if we just cast our mind back 12 months, what's happened in a year has been the passage of the Act,
Yep.
long anticipated. We had the formation of the Online Safety Regulators Network on this stage,
Yep.
12 months ago. We've had the AI Safety Summit, which appeared almost out of nowhere. And then, I mean, our own research into Gen AI. And I guess we just bear in mind all of these things that have occurred in the last year. Gill, why don't we start with the release only last week of the first guidelines on how tech firms will have to comply and the consultation process that went with it. Can you talk us through that?
Sure, and as you mentioned earlier in your opening speech, in the 17 years of the FOSI conference, it feels like it's rolling news now. I mean,
Yeah.
it is really at the moment. So it's an incredible time to be working in the field of online safety. In terms of the Act, the Online Safety Act is vast. There are complexities, as we all know. So what we have done is broken it down into manageable chunks, and we've started with illegal harms. So some of the most egregious, serious online harms that exist today, and that includes child sexual abuse material, it includes grooming, it includes terror, and it includes fraud and fraudulent content. And what we have done is set out what we consider standards, best practice of what firms who have risk in those areas to be able to get that risk down. Now, it's not prescriptive, so if you follow those standards, then that is deemed safe harbor and you're deemed to have complied. But because we are very interested in innovation, if you have alternative ways of reducing the same risk, then we're really open to that, because what we want to do is find solutions that work, and we know for the tech sector, for whom innovation is rife and very welcome, we're keen that those solutions keep pace with the market.
And do you have other consultations coming up?
We do. We have just in December, we're putting out our views on age assurance, in particular for pornography services. A lot of our evidence shows that children as young as 8 are accidentally stumbling across pornography, often quite serious pornography on the web, and we want to reduce them ordinarily accessing content that is really age inappropriate for them. So that will come out in December, and then in the spring next year will be our wider consultation on protecting children.
I want to stay with you because how are you going to harmonize all of this? The Online Safety Act with the DSA in Europe, with the Australian rules that they have developed over a number of years, and for that matter, the regulatory framework in the US. How on earth would you go about?
It's a really important question, and we recognise that, we think there's 100,000 services in scope of the UK's Online Safety Act. Many of those operate globally. So we know this is really important harmonisation, and we want to harmonise where possible. So if I think of the DSA in Europe and the Online Safety Act in the UK, I'd say they are regulatory cousins, but they're not identical twins. But where they do share some really important features in common. So they do place a duty of care on tech firms to play their part in reducing harm, but also they're about systems and processes. So they are not content takedown legislation. We don't have powers to instruct firms to take content down. We're not there to surveil or censor. We're there to improve governance, improve standards, improve safety by design. So there are some of the things that they share in common. And I think the onus is on us to explain what they have in common, but also where the differences are. And that's one of the reasons why we've invested so heavily in the Global Online Safety Regulator Network, which I hope you will hear a lot more on from in the years to come. You'll have heard from the Vice Chair next year, Dr. Mashilo Boloko from South Africa, who is my colleague, who I work really closely with. And I'll be taking on the chairmanship of that network next year. So it is absolutely paramount that we both share learnings between us, but that we also communicate to industry and to stakeholders where the commonality between these different regimes are, so that they're workable for industry.
Brilliant. Becca, how's the FTC implementing COPPA, and for that matter, any important enforcement actions that have occurred recently?
Yeah, and there are a couple of threads that Jill mentioned that I can pick up on, starting with the last one, which is that harmony and directional convergence among international regulators is good for regulators, but it is also good for industry. It is how you foster coherent innovation, development, business growth, opportunity, and we really want to see that. The US hasn't had, much to many people's chagrin, including mine, new legislation in this area recently, but there have been really important developments, many of which are consistent with some of the themes that we're seeing across the ocean and around the country. So I want to just back up and be clear, the FTC's main enforcement tools in this area are the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits unfair and deceptive acts and practices and unfair methods of competition, as well as the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is much more specific and granular in its prohibitions. The FTC Act has broad general terms. It's been around for a century, and those broad general terms allow us to adapt our enforcement to ongoing changes in the market and keep pace with new technologies and new developments. That's very important. COPPA has long been known for its most prominent provision, which is the requirement of verified parental consent before children's data is collected. But that's not the only thing COPPA requires. COPPA actually also has some, I think, long underattended provisions requiring the minimization of data that is collected from children, and the prohibition of conditioning access to a service on providing more data, on children providing more data than is necessary. So what we've been doing across our mission areas is looking at our statutory tools and thinking about how we can adapt our enforcement efforts to keep pace with these changes that we're seeing in the marketplace. So let me talk about a couple of those things. So we put out a policy statement on COPPA about 15 months ago that said that we were going to look at these provisions that go beyond the VPC control. And I will just pause to note that Stephen mentioned that I have 4 children. So I think about these things as a parent as well as a professional. I also have 2 very good degrees from a good university and some expertise in online safety and technology and a fair amount of technical literacy. And I find parental control systems extremely challenging to use effectively. And I say that it's almost embarrassing to admit, but I think it's important to acknowledge that if I find it challenging to do, both in terms of quantity and time and access and intelligibility, there are going to be very few people who really can effectively manage their children's online engagement. And so making sure that all of the burden is not just on parents who, I will acknowledge, can feel quite burdened already, but also on the companies in the first instance who are better positioned to responsibly control, collect, and refuse to collect data is a really important thing. So we put out the statement saying that we were going to focus on these other provisions of COPPA. We followed that up with some enforcement action, including a case against Edmodo, which was an ed tech provider. where that was collecting children's data without parental consent, and among the requirements is that Edmodo can't collect more data than is reasonably necessary to provide the service or for the child to access the service that they're providing. So that's an important development. Another really important case we brought in the last year involved Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite. It was a multi-pronged case that resulted in a $500 million penalty. There were two parts of the case. One was a privacy part and one was a dark patterns part. I think they're both related to children's online safety, including protections against fraud. The really interesting thing about the privacy part was that the complaint alleged that the default settings in Fortnite allowed strangers to communicate with children, and that was not only a violation of COPPA, it was also an unfair practice under the FTC Act, and it was unfair not only as to COPPA-covered children, but also teenagers. So this is a really important development in the US because we think of our child safety laws only covering children under 13, but what we acknowledged in this case is that teenagers are also sensitive, and allowing default communication with them can be quite dangerous. And so moving forward on that was a really important step for us. We have also been focusing on data security issues around children's data. And I think people tend to think of security and privacy as a little bit separate, but I think it's actually very important because lax security is a thing that can facilitate all sorts of privacy violations and downstream harms about which we are concerned. So one of the first cases in which we implemented a data minimization requirement was a case against Chegg, which was also an ed tech provider. That was about a year ago. Of course, we are pursuing an order enforcement action in our administrative court against Meta, who we allege has violated the order that was the result of them violating the first order that was the result of them violating the FTC Act. And so we're trying to take a more aggressive approach to make sure that we are really prohibiting future violations. And then finally, on the rulemaking front, we have an ongoing rulemaking on data security and commercial surveillance. That's not particularly targeted at children, but the record we received has lots of comments that talk about the issues related to children and broad issue. If we move forward on any kind of rule out of that, the broad issues will necessarily affect children's online environment as well.
Interesting. Now, I know you can't speak on behalf of the Commission. However, is it a frustration within the building that there's still not a federal privacy bill?
It's a huge frustration. It's a frustration for me personally, and all of the commissioners have said it is something they want to see have happen too. Also, actually all of the sitting commissioners right now are parents of young children. So we're all, I think, very attuned to children's online safety issues. And my children are a little bit older than my colleagues, so I'm really seeing firsthand with my 9 and 11-year-olds the kinds, I'm afraid of the things that they will have access to, despite, again, all of my best efforts to really impose digital literacy and have conversations with them and have a open and discussing household. So it's hugely frustrating. It's enormously frustrating. It's also not a problem that we can immediately solve. So I will continue to advocate that Congress acts, but I also think it's incumbent on us where we see problems in the market that can be better addressed by current law than they have been in the past, to use that current law to address those problems, right. Which is part of why we have done things like the COPPA policy statement, like the cases that I'm talking about, and like the commercial surveillance and data security rulemaking. We can do less than Congress could do with a new law. We can only, by rule, address conduct that is already illegal under the FTC Act. That's a lot of things, but it is a much smaller universe than what Congress could do. But we're paying attention to the developments in other jurisdictions and thinking about what are the needs that other people are seeing in the market and whether or not any of those might be covered by existing law.
Okay, thank you. Jill?
Well, I'd love to come back to Becca's point around parental controls, because I've been here all day today and we've discussed parental controls a lot. And I'd love to just take it back to, in a way, the first research that you presented this morning, because the question, I was really struck by the phraseology, because the question was sort of who bears the responsibility, and the answer from the 3 countries that were polled came back as parents ahead of government and ahead of industry. But if you asked a different question, which is who should bear the responsibility, then I think you might get different answers. And I think particularly in the UK, you'd get a different answer as well. And I think our research shows in particular that not only, and I'm a parent of 2 myself, and that having gone through everyone's leaflets, which I've been very grateful to receive today, but the number of parental controls and how different they are for every single platform, and knowing how many apps my kids are on, there is a burden to that. And that brings me to just some of the practical suggestions around what more industry can do to help play a role in this space. And if I take one example of grooming that you touched on there in terms of unwanted friend requests, our research shows that the sort of modus operandi of groomers is to go online and often do scattergun friends requests. So they are hitting 1,000 people in one session in the hope of getting 1 or 2 positive responses, and then sadly that's the pathway to grooming and how it can start. And children are telling us, and our research is showing, that 70% of children in the UK at secondary school age have had unwanted contact from people they don't know, that they don't welcome, and that they're worried by that. So this is, and when we speak to children, which we do a lot, they tell us that they can be receiving that frequently, many times a day. And so what we're suggesting in our grooming proposals is that platforms actually start making changes to prevent the limit of unwanted contact from children. And I think these are some from adults posing as children, or from people that they don't know. And so I think it's not all about parental controls, and actually there are some really practical steps that platforms can do more of, large and small, in order to reduce these risks that can be so serious at an individual level.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I just want to make clear, I don't think of parental control and improvement in default settings, for example, as mutually exclusive. I'm not advocating giving parents no role. I just think it should not be the entirety of the burden on parents to do things that they are probably not best positioned to do.
Cool. Can I take you back to the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, and maybe say a little bit more about what it is you are actually doing within that network to harmonize things? And to throw in a sort of devil's advocate question, isn't it just becoming too complicated for companies to follow all of these different regimes? How would you respond to that?
So I think the network which Julie has chaired, Julie Immigrant from Australia, e-Safety Commissioner in Australia, has done an amazing job of chairing the network in its inaugural first year. Obviously, it was announced at this point last year, and we've really focused on growing the network in its first year. So the members are regulators who have duties to implement online safety regulation in their respective jurisdiction, and that goes from Korea to Fiji to South Africa to Australia to the UK to Ireland. And then we also have observer status, which is sort of a variety of stakeholders with a real interest and shared goals in terms of what they're trying to achieve. That's been the sort of focus of this last year. I think next year what we really want to do is build momentum in that membership, both membership and observers, but also really increase our communication to industry in particular, so that we can help them navigate these multiple jurisdictions.
Is this something the US should get involved in?
Yeah, well, look, consistent with what I said earlier, I think it is good for everybody, for different jurisdictions to be as aligned as possible, consistent with their respective legal frameworks, and cognizant of the fact that sometimes those are different. I would be more worried about how possible it is to follow different regulations if I had some sense that they were developing in contradictory ways rather than complementary ways. And maybe there are some ways that they are that I'm not aware of, but I don't have that sense right now. I see a lot of common threads. I also think it's important to note that when a company chooses to operate in multiple jurisdictions, That is a choice that they make. It is not a requirement for any business. And with that choice comes the responsibility to follow the rules of those jurisdictions. I think, like I said, it's good for business and good for markets for companies to be able to operate in many places and grow innovation and access. But I also don't think it's an entitlement. And I think we should worry most about who our primary constituencies are, which are the citizens of the countries that we represent and work for. That has to be the first thing that we're paying attention. And in this topic, it's the children, which is the most important thing that we as adults and as parents and as caregivers are paying attention to.
Okay. You know, we've had the recent creation of the Interagency Task Force on Online Health and Safety. What do you feel about that? Is that something you feel optimistic about? Do you think that there's some kind of concrete solutions that will come out of that?
Yeah, well, I think NTIA has a request for comment out right now, and that's a great positive development. It's always good when agencies are talking to each other and making sure, just like internationally, I think it's great for us to be as aligned as possible. Domestically, that's true too. We are more effective when we are working coherently and cooperatively. I know this has been a big focus of the president. I will also note it's consistent with the fact that he directed an all-of-government approach to competition. That's the right way for different agencies to be thinking about very relevant for the FTC's interest, but we care a lot about how other agencies are making rules that are going to affect the competitive dynamics of markets. We want to see businesses compete to provide the best, safest, highest quality services. So I actually think some of this interagency work is relevant to competition as well. But I think that coordination is, it's hard to think of how it could be a negative thing.
Yeah, and just for the record, we've been calling for a chief online safety officer for the United States since 2008 and the Obama transition team. But who's counting the number of years? Okay, we're quickly running out of time. Obviously, AI, or Gen AI, has been a big focus for our event, the AI Safety Summit that just happened, the executive order. I mean, from your perspectives, how is AI going to impact your work, your areas of concern, how you're going to operate? And I mean, folks are saying this is as big as electricity. You know, it's just going to completely change everything. What are your thoughts?
So firstly, it's always important to, as regulators, we often start on the risk, but let's start on the opportunity. So, and I really like the framing of the research earlier when it was talking about are you using it for efficiency boosting, or are you using it for analysis, or are you using it for creativity, and how that varied a little bit by generation and by country, and that was really interesting. So from thinking about the work that we do, immediately its potential in terms of digesting and summarizing large text is really relevant to what we do. And some of the applications on boosting efficiency I'm really interested as well. So part of me is thinking about how we use it. On the other side, we've got to think about, where does it pose risks in the area that we are regulating? And actually, the Online Safety Act has been in the UK has been written as a technology neutral piece of legislation. So the idea is we focus on the use case and the context. So we're focusing on the specific risk. The example might be child sexual abuse material or a risk of terrorist content being widely disseminated. So we focus on the risk rather than the technology. And of course, Gen AI having come up through the passage of legislation has been a good litmus test of that. There are plenty of applications and use cases of Gen AI that we can already see today that are fully in scope of the bill. See, I said bill then, not act, it's been signed. So let me give a few examples. So if search is powered by, say Bing is powered by ChatGPT or Google Search is powered by Bard, then by being a search service, we'd be regulating any risk that the search service might pose to users rather than technology. So those applications of Gen AI will be fully in scope, and we'll be looking for those firms to do risk assessments, and if they're making changes, to do a risk assessment before they make the change. Likewise, if a Deepfake is being used for fraudulent purposes. We had one of our big newsreaders in the UK last week who had a deepfake that went round to promote fraud, and even her hairdresser fell for it because it was that convincing, and then promptly got 20 phone calls a day to try and get money out of him. So that falls into scope because it's about fraud, and likewise, if child sexual abuse material is being generated by an image generator, then that will fall into scope. So I think what we will therefore try and offer with full humility is a set of learnings as to how we can understand the risks and how we can look to mitigate the risk and work with tech firms at large to really be effective in that. And I'm sure these things, we won't have all the use cases in scope, of course we won't, and these things will need to iterate over time, and AI regulation is a much bigger, broader question, but hopefully we can play a role in being useful to that debate.
Brilliant, thank you. Becca.
Yeah, just quickly, I think I am conscious of the opportunities provided by generative AI, but also a little wary of a sort of AI exceptionalism narrative that would keep us from remembering that we have, at the FTC, for example, applied our 100-year-old statutes to lots of new developments in technology again and again, and I think we similarly can in this case. There are a couple of big areas that we're on the lookout for that we think are well covered by the FTC Act, including turbocharging fraud, impersonation, exacerbation of unfair or discriminatory decision-making. I think that we're also really sensitive to the competitive dynamics of the AI market and making sure that as this new technology develops, it really can develop and be implemented broadly, and that the market isn't subject to bottlenecks. So I think that part's really important. And then the last thing I'll mention is I think we will apply current law. AI is not a legal vacuum. However, it is important for us to keep our technological tools sharp to make sure that we are understanding the developments in the marketplace. So one other development at the FTC that I haven't mentioned is that we stood up an Office of Technology. And we had an overwhelming interest from brilliant technologists in coming to work for us. And they're already using those skills to help us not only understand our enforcement matters, do research, convene roundtables, and make sure that our technological expertise is as sharp as our legal and our economic thinking as we engage these new issues.
Well, brilliant. What a great summation. We'll get you a federal privacy bill,
Great.
promise. You have enough acts to deal with. But we'll definitely keep having you back. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the incredible work that both of you are doing. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becca.
Thanks, Stephen.